John Calvin is, without a doubt, among the most influential and controversial figures of church history. Even to this very day, we find John Calvin mentioned very positively and very negatively in our circles. So much so that it was a major issue at the Southern Baptist Convention in June of 2012, and then since then a task force has been created to study the impact of Calvinism on the Southern Baptist Convention. So today we're going to be talking about John Calvin himself, and as you can expect, he's generated a lot of comments. Here's just a sampling of those who adore Calvin, and then we'll talk about those who abhor Calvin. A French historian, Ernest Renan, said that Calvin was the most Christian man of his age. Even a Lutheran historian said Calvin was one of those strong and consistent men of history who people either liked or disliked, adored or abhorred. C.H. Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers, everybody's favorite Baptist, said, "The longer I live, the clearer does it appear that John Calvin's system is the nearest to perfection." That's right. Scottish theologian, you'd expect him to be favorable toward Calvin. Calvin is the man who, next to St. Paul, has done most good to mankind. This is significant. Theodore Beza was Calvin's successor and biographer and co-worker, and Beza said, "I have been a witness of him for 16 years, and I think that I am fully entitled to say that in this man, Calvin, there was exhibited to all an example of the life and death of the Christian, such as it will not be easy to depreciate, and it will be difficult to imitate." All right, and then Philip Schaff said, "Taking into account all his failings, Calvin must be reckoned as one of the greatest and best of men whom God raised up in the history of Christianity." All right, well, speaking of his failings, I think Beza has been disproved that some have found it very easy to depreciate Calvin. So among those who abhor him, we include Roland Bainton, who was a great biographer of Martin Luther and certainly an advocate of the free church. Bainton said, "If Calvin ever wrote anything in favor of religious liberty, it was a typographical error." All right. Calvin has, I believe, caused untold millions of souls to be damned. This is a quote from Jimmy Swaggart, who he himself has little to commend him, but anyway, that's what he said. Here's another comment by a contemporary of Calvin, who's anonymous. "Better with Beza in hell than with Calvin in heaven." All right. So, and there are certainly others comments that I can make, but nonetheless, this gives us a bit of an introduction to John Calvin as we consider his life, his works, his writings, his theology, and of course, as we consider his legacy today, we will at least have a bit of an understanding of the foundation of the doctrine that has come to be known as Calvinism. All right, the background to Calvin is the French Reformation. Renaissance and French humanism developed at the University of Paris. The French Reformation emerged through a series of leading humanists, many of whom came into favor with royalty, such as Francis's sister, Marguerite. The Bishop Briquenet appointed Lefebvre and Guillaume Farel as preachers and teachers in his diocese, and Guillaume Farel will play a major role in our story. And the laity began to pressure for more reforms and began to pressure for iconoclasm. Remember, that's the icon smashers, those who did not want to use icons in worship. They felt that it was idolatry. But there was resistance to the Reformation, certainly from Pope Clement VII, who urged repression, and therefore he put pressure on Bishop Briquenet to dismiss Farel and other reforming preachers. But the reform movement nevertheless spread to Paris, Lyon, and Noyon. Forgive me, I never took French, so there's probably some French speakers in here that could do a much better job with these names than I am. But Francis I was released from prison in Spain due to the influence of Pope Clement, and so he was obligated to the Pope to promote Catholicism and oppress the Reformation. But his sister Marguerite favored reforms. But then we have the affair of the placards. October 1534, placards began to appear in several cities denouncing the Roman Catholic Mass. They were printed in Neuchâtel, where Farel and other reformers had preached. And so then Francis began to persecute Protestants, who were known as the Huguenots. An unusual term. Let me postpone discussing the origin of the term until later. But nonetheless, the French Protestants were known as Huguenots. 200 arrests were made within a month of the affair of the placards, and then there were 20 executions. So the suppression of the Reformation was strong in France. So we get to John Calvin, born Jean Calvin in Noyon. He was the son of a lawyer who was in service of a bishop. Now, it's interesting that his father, the lawyer, set Calvin aside for service in the church, quite the opposite of Martin Luther's father, who desired Luther to go into law instead of the church. But because of his father's connection to the church, he felt that the church would be a lucrative income for his son, and in fact he had him tonsured at age 12. Now, do you remember that the tonsure is when a bald spot is shaved away at the crown of the head, and it is a sign of a person's vows to the clergy. So at age 12, he set Calvin aside for an ecclesiastical career, and even at age 12, he began to receive benefices. That is, he began to receive income as priest of various churches. All right, so you see how corrupt this system is? That a 12-year-old not serving the church, but receiving the income from the church. So, the church was in serious need of reform. He was educated at a variety of universities and really was brilliant. Now let's put this into chronological context. Calvin is a second-generation reformer. 1521, Calvin was tonsured at 12. 1521 was when Luther took his stand at the Diet of Worms. All right. 2 years later, Zwingli's Reformation was established in Zurich when Calvin was 14. 1526, Calvin completed his Master of Arts in Philosophy. But the year before that, the Anabaptists began performing believers' baptism, and the next year, the first Anabaptist martyrs and the Schleitheim Confession. So you see that as Calvin was growing up and establishing himself in college, other reformers had already developed their reform. Now he was, in the beginning, he was a humanist, he was a scholar, well-versed in Latin and Greek. He published a commentary on Seneca's treatise De Clementia, that is, on mercy. And it possibly was an indirect plea to Francis I for clemency regarding the emerging evangelical movement. Notice also that the Pope at that time was named Clement the Seventh. All right, so he's still a humanist, but he is showing his sympathies for the French Reformation. Well, his friend Nicolas Cope was elected the rector of the University of Paris in 1533, and when Nicolas gave his inaugural address, it included a number of evangelical overtones with quotes from Luther and Erasmus. Well, the outcry was so great from the Catholic establishment that Cope was forced to flee, and then Calvin was too, because of his friendship with Cope and suspicions that he co-authored the address. And so John Calvin began to be suspected of tendencies, sympathies toward the Reformation, and so he was forced to flee from Paris. So probably at this time, 1533, either in Paris or in exile, Calvin became a convinced Protestant. Calvin is not like Luther in the sense that Luther, being perhaps more emotional, certainly because of table talk, certainly because of Luther's frequent sharing of his testimony in support of his doctrine of justification by grace through faith. We know a lot about Luther's conversion experience. We know very little about how Calvin moved from being a Catholic priest from age 12 to being a reformer. All we have is a kind of a vague statement from his the preface to his commentary on the Psalms, but this is what he says. What happened first was that by an unexpected conversion, God tamed to teachableness a mind too stubborn for its years. For I was so strongly devoted to the superstitions of the papacy that nothing less could draw me from such depth of mire. All right? What's important is that about this time he did abandon his Catholic faith, which meant that he abandoned his benefices, the income that he'd had from age 12. So that's a fairly significant renunciation and a significant step toward a new direction in his life.
He's also 24 at this point.
He's, thank you, 24.
That's extremely young. Even back then, right? Like, that's not just my generation thinking, oh, that guy's 24, and not only does he have his master's, I think his doctorate, I know we haven't touched on it yet, but didn't he get his doctorate?
I'm not sure about that, about the age for his doctorate, but we do need to remember that people did advance through their educational degrees at a faster pace than we do today. So 24 is not abnormally young to have completed these degrees, but it is still a young age for him to have made these decisions. But he's been through a lot.
Because it was at 17, or I think it was at 17, that he was thought to have co-authored an inaugural address for the president of a university.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I would have, I mean, 17, I would have been thinking about
Right. Well, I think Jeff, you're making a good point that yes, that John Calvin was brilliant.
Yeah.
He was intellectually very advanced, and we very capable. So you're right. And that is a good point to make. That he certainly was very intelligent, very capable, and yes, And in 1536, he's about to write a work that is going to make him famous and is going to still be read today. Okay, so that's next. So the 1536, he published his first edition of the Institutes of Christian Religion. Now, there are a number of things important about this document, but one thing in particular, just aside from the influence that it's had over the centuries, is that when you think about the writings of Luther, Zwingli, and the Anabaptists, these men are writing in response to a crisis. We call this occasional writing. They were writing because of a certain occasion. Luther is writing against indulgences, or he's writing to appeal to the nobility, or he's writing in response to needs in his congregation. Same thing with Zwingli. He's writing to convince the Zurich City Council of the need for reform. Anabaptists are writing in defense of their beliefs. But John Calvin does something different. He sits down and very purposefully writes, in a sense, the first systematic theology of the Protestant Reformation. So that's one thing that is significant about the Institutes of Christian Religion, is that it is a writing, possibly the first, that systematically presents Protestant theology. He intended it to be an elementary textbook for the Christian faith, and the Apostles' Creed provided the outline, and the first edition was small enough to fit in the large pocket of an overcoat, so that it was very transportable. Now it would be very difficult to carry around the 2 volumes of the final 1559 edition, but nonetheless this first edition was small and was intended to be transportable. It was dedicated to Francis I, the King of France, as an apology for evangelicals, with the hopes that Francis would read it, would understand that Protestants were not a threat to the French crown. But of course, it did not work that way. The subsequent editions, 1539, the second edition was greatly enlarged. These editions, by the way, were written in Latin, and then 1541 we have the first edition written in French. 1559 is the 8th and final edition, and that is the one that we are most familiar with, published in 2 volumes, as we know. All right, 1536, Calvin sets out for, actually he sets out for Strasbourg, but he's intercepted in Geneva. Well, why did he go to Geneva? Well, let's talk a little bit about the city. 1527, we have an alliance of the city-states of Geneva, Bern, and Fribourg in order to overthrow the control of the Roman Catholic bishop and the Duke of Savoy. So here we have Swiss cantons seeking independence of foreign domination. Bern was already committed to the Protestant Reformation. Fribourg, however, continued to be committed to Roman Catholicism. Even though they had overthrown the bishop, they still were committed to the faith of Roman Catholicism. And so Bern and Fribourg are struggling over the controlling influence over Geneva. Well, in 1535, a disputation in Geneva decided by the council in Geneva in favor of the Reformation. So this is similar to what happened in Zurich in 1523. A public debate settled in favor of the Reformation. In 1536, the bishop and the duke attacked, but Bern allied with Geneva against the oppressors, and that confirmed the Reformation in Geneva in May 21st, 1536. All right, so here we have a commitment to the Reformation in Geneva, and it is that time that Calvin shows up. He leaves for Strasbourg because he wants the academic life. He wants to settle down and study and write. But as he's heading in that direction, unfortunately he encounters a war between Francis I and Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember Charles V, the one who called Martin Luther to the Diet of Worms. He's attacking Francis I, the King of France, and this war blocks the way. And so Calvin takes a detour, and he goes to Geneva. He intends to stay there for one night. But who's there? Guillaume Farel, that reformer that we've already talked about in Paris, has come to Geneva, and he heard that Calvin was there. This author of the Institutes of Christian Religion that has already made a name for Calvin. And Farel seeks him out at the inn, urges him to stay in Geneva to be his partner in developing the Reformation in the city. Calvin at first refuses, saying, "No, it's my goal to live a quiet academic life. I want to go and study and to write." But Farel says, if you refuse to devote yourself with us in the work, God will condemn you. So you can see in this picture, there's Farel, and he's really going at it with Calvin. And Calvin is convinced that indeed he must stay, and so he decides to stay in Geneva, and he and Farel then work together to bring about reform. Well, at first he organized the church in Geneva with an emphasis on church discipline. Now, often we associate Calvin with his theology, and rightfully so, but at the same time, we need to remember that one of his major emphases was church discipline. And so he would refuse to administer the Lord's Supper to anyone who did not live up to his standards of Christian behavior. And so he began to be opposed by some in Geneva, because you see that even though these Genevans had supported the idea of Reformation, for many of them the idea was, we want to rid ourselves of outside oppression by the Duke of Savoy and the Roman Catholic Pope. But really, we just want to live our lives the way we want to. All right? They weren't really serious about living the Christian life in every aspect of their behavior. And so here comes Calvin and Farel enforcing this. In fact, I suspect Farel saw this in the life of the Genevans and felt like he needed someone with a strong hand like Calvin to help him to shape the behavior and the moral lifestyle of Geneva. Well, in reaction, the Genevans elected 4 councilmen who opposed the reform and the preachers. And then, at one point, when Calvin refused to administer the Lord's Supper to certain individuals, then the council voted to expel Calvin and Farel. So, after 2 years, Calvin and Farel were banished from Geneva. Farel went to Neuchâtel, and Calvin then finally got to go to Strasbourg. All right, so he went to Strasbourg, and there he found Martin Bucer leading the Reformation there. Does anyone remember the last time we encountered Martin Bucer?
He was persuaded by Luther at the Heidelberg dispensation.
Good job, Lawrence. Thank you very much. Yes, Martin Bucer was a fellow Augustinian monk, and he was present at the Heidelberg disputation when Luther defended himself, when he presented his contrasting theology, the theology of the cross versus the theology of glory. And Martin Bucer was convinced that Luther was right,
and he was convinced to take up the Reformation, the theology of the cross, and he left the Augustinian monastery and went to Strasbourg there to establish and to forward the Reformation there. Well, when Calvin came to Strasbourg, again, Calvin's idea was to retire to a library and to read and to write. But Bucer knew that there were many French refugees who had come to Strasbourg fleeing the persecution in France, and he knew that these French people needed a pastor for their church. And so, again, Calvin resisted, but Bucer took a page from Farel's Manual of Persuasion and threatened Calvin that if he does not pastor this church in Strasbourg, that he will be going against God's will. So Calvin took up this task of ministering to a congregation of 500 refugees. Well, while he was in Strasbourg, Calvin decided that he probably needed a wife. Certainly he looked around him at other reformers and liked what he saw. For a time, what's that? All right. He for a time he was living with Martin Bucer and his wife Elizabeth, and he admired their home as the inn of righteousness. Bucer was so pleased with marriage that he urged marriage for all his ministerial colleagues, saying to Calvin, "You ought to have a wife." Philip Melanchthon also had been married for 19 years, and his marriage was a happy one. Evidently, Mrs. Melanchthon had a rollicking sense of humor and took good care of Philip in every way. Philip's only complaint was, "She always thinks that I am dying of hunger unless I am stuffed like a sausage." So Calvin realized that he too needed someone to take care of him. So he told his associates that he was now in the market for a wife and that he was open to any suggestions. Now here were Calvin's job qualifications. "Always keep in mind what I seek to find in her, for I am none of those insane lovers who embrace also the vices of those with whom they are in love, where they are smitten at first sight with a fine figure. This only is the beauty that allures me, if she is chaste, if not too fussy or fastidious, if economical, if patient, if there is hope that she will be interested in my health." Okay, and of course these were concerns because Calvin had some personal problems that he thought might be eased, if not solved, by a wife. He said, "I can't call a single penny my own. It is astonishing how money slips away in extraordinary expenses." He must have been a seminary student or faculty member. It is said that his health was poor. He was not a good manager of his own affairs. His impatience and irritability might be softened by marriage. So, in 1539, he decided that he should be married, and he reserved a date a little after Easter. And he made an appointment with his friend Farel, whom he wanted to officiate at the ceremony. But unfortunately, he didn't have a particular bride in mind, just the date. A few months later, all right, come on, what was that?
No, it was predetermined.
It was predetermined. That's right. But actually, his predetermination turned out not to be true. Remember what I said about not setting dates. All right, the first candidate was a wealthy German woman. And her brother was a strong supporter of Calvin and said that such a marriage would be beneficial. Calvin had often said he wished to live the life of a scholar, and obviously, the sale of theological books didn't provide much income then or now.
So it'd be helpful for him to have a wealthy wife. Well, Calvin had two problems. First, she didn't know any French and didn't want to learn it. And then second, if she brought a large dowry to the marriage, he thought it might be embarrassing that he was living off of his wife. So he disregarded this first candidate. Well, Farrell had a candidate to suggest. She spoke French. She was a devout Protestant, but she was about 15 years older than Calvin. So Calvin didn't follow up on that one. Let's see. The next candidate spoke French, didn't have money, was highly recommended by friends. Calvin seemed interested enough to invite her to Strasbourg for an interview. But that fell through. We don't know why. All right. Now Calvin is 31. John is embarrassed by these off-again, on-again romances. And he said, I have not found a wife and frequently hesitate as to whether I ought any more to seek one. But when he stopped seeking, he found. All right, guys who are single in here, perhaps that's a key, that when you stop seeking, you will find. In the congregation of the refugees was a young widow named Idelette de Bure-Stordure. She and her husband and their 2 children had come to Strasbourg as Anabaptists. But after listening to Calvin's faithful exposition of Scripture, they were converted to his Reformed theology. All right, here's a long paragraph I want to read. Idelette's husband had been an Anabaptist leader, and undoubtedly Calvin had discussed theological matters with them in their home. In 1537, when Calvin was in Geneva for his first stay, Stordure had come to that city to debate with the reformers there, but he lost the debate, was ordered out of Geneva and returned to Strasbourg. The discussions continued then when Calvin arrived in Strasbourg 2 years later, and eventually he convinced the Stordures of his Reformed theology. So, the Stordures were in the Calvin's church, partaking of the Lord's Supper. Eventually, he had their son baptized by Calvin, and the whole family became members of the church which Calvin was pastoring. But then in the spring of 1540, Jean Stordure, stricken with the plague, suddenly died. Idelette grieved for the loss of her husband. John sorrowed for the loss of a friend. And then Martin Bucer suggested to Calvin, why not consider Idelette? And John did. Idelette was attractive and intelligent, a woman with culture, apparently from an upper middle class background. She was also a woman of character and quiet strength. So in August of 1540, John and Idelette were married. All right, both of them became ill shortly after the wedding. Calvin wrote, as if it had been so ordered, or predestined, so to speak, that our wedlock might not be overjoyous, the Lord thus thwarted our joy by moderating it. And in his writings, Calvin didn't say much about his personal circumstances, so we don't know as much about Calvin's marriage as we do about Luther's. You know, we talked about Luther's wit and wisdom about marriage. We don't have that from Calvin. But Calvin's biographers speak of her as a woman of some force and individuality. John described her as the faithful helper of my ministry, the best companion of my life. So he seemed to be happy in his marriage. Then in 1541 he was called from Strasbourg to Geneva, and so all of a sudden Idelette was forced to consider leaving her home for a new place. But the Council of Geneva sent a herald and a 2-horse carriage to Idelette to bring her and the children and the family furniture from Strasbourg to Geneva. During their marriage, Idelette had bore 3 children, but all 3 died at birth. So John and Idelette did not have any children of their own, but Idelette did bring a son and a daughter from her previous marriage to their home.
Well, as you can imagine, as Calvin began to face opposition from those in Geneva, Idelette was grieved over some of the names that she heard, addressed to her husband. Citizens called their dogs by the name Calvin. And then these insults began to touch on Idelette. And here's the situation when, because her husband was an Anabaptist, when they married, they did not have a civil ceremony, and so they were not seen as married officially by the state. Obviously, Anabaptists, with their separation of church and state, would not have a civil ceremony. And so in Geneva, the gossip spread the word that Idelette was a woman of ill repute, that she'd simply been living with her previous husband. Her 2 children had been born out of wedlock, and that was the reason why they were unable to have children, because God was punishing them for her previous immorality. So you can see how the people in Geneva used their hostility toward Calvin and aimed spite at Idelette. So that was unfortunate. But Idelette still worked with Calvin to keep him on an even keel. Friends remarked that John was in better control of his temper, and no doubt Idelette diffused numerous explosions. She was still in her 30s when disease began to impact her health, probably tuberculosis. In 1549, just when she just turned 40, she lay dying. She'd been married to John for only 9 years. On the day of her death, John was impressed with her serenity. She suddenly cried out in such a way that all could see that her spirit had risen far above this world. These were her words: "O glorious resurrection, O God of Abraham and of all our fathers, the believers of all the ages have trusted on Thee, and none of them have hoped in vain, and now I fix my hope on Thee." Okay, then she died. It is said that John had known much about God the Father as sovereign. Through her life and in her death, Idelette taught him a little bit about the Holy Spirit as a comforter. Okay, so that's just a little excursus on John's marriage to Idelette, but it helps us get a little bit of a picture of humanity about John Calvin and his marriage to Idelette and what she brought to the marriage. Okay, anything? All right. Well, let's move on. Well, you can see while he was in Strasbourg, he did continue to write. He wrote the second Latin edition and the first French edition of the Institutes of Christian Religion. He wrote his commentary on Romans, and then he had occasion to write what some have described as the most succinct defense of the Reformation written at that time, and that was his reply to Sadoleto, which he wrote in 1540. Now, Cardinal Sadoleto was an agent of the Catholic Church, hoping to bring these regions that had abandoned Catholicism for the Protestant Reformation. He sought to bring them back into the fold. And when Calvin left Geneva, he took advantage of that to write a letter to the Geneva Council attempting to persuade them to revert to Roman Catholicism. Well, there was no one in Geneva with the capacity to respond to Sadoleto, and so they asked Calvin to intervene. His reply was a masterpiece, and as he wrote it, forwarded it on to Geneva, who then replied to Sadoleto. He gained almost universal favor in Geneva. He was invited to return, which he did, even though he said he would rather die 100 times than to go back to take up the cross daily at Geneva. Okay, but nonetheless, he did go back to Geneva, and he in September of 1541, when he got there,
Of course, his practice was to preach through the Bible, and on that Sunday, he ascended to his pulpit. He opened up his Bible to the place where he had left it and began preaching with no reference to his exile, as if he had never left. He just picked up where he left off and began to preach. We also picked up where he left off in terms of his reform, and in 1541 he published his ecclesiastical ordinances, in which he taught the fourfold ministry of the church. That is, pastors, teachers, elders, and deacons. He called them doctors, but we think of them as teachers. So, in the fourfold ministry, the whole life of the church was covered. Its worship, its education, its soundness and purity, and its works of love and mercy. So here are the four offices. To the pastors was committed the ministry of the Word and sacraments. To the doctors or teachers, they had the responsibility for education, both for adults and for children. The third order was that of elders. And for Calvin, the elders were lay people who lived in every district of the city. At that time, 4 quarters of Geneva. And in every district there were 1 or 2 elders who would keep an eye on spiritual affairs. All right, I'm quoting. All right, they were going to keep an eye on their neighbors. If they saw, for example, that so-and-so was frequently the worse for drink, or that Mr. X beat up his wife, or that Mr. Y and Mrs. Z were seeing rather a lot of each other, then these elders were to admonish them in a brotherly manner. If the response was unsatisfactory, they were to report the matter to the consistory. The consistory was a board made up of ministers and lay people, and the consistory then would summon the offender, remonstrate with him or her. If this failed, they would at last resort pronounce excommunication, which would remain in force until that person repented. All right, so that was the pastors, the teachers, and the elders. All right, and then finally, the deacons were in charge of the social welfare work. They were the hospital management board, Social Security, so on and so forth. They supervised the alms and so on. So that was the fourfold ministry under John Calvin. The pastors would meet for mutual criticism, and the consistory consisted of the ministers of Geneva plus 12 laymen drawn from the civil councils. And this was an ecclesiastical court with an integration of civil force and church-state union. The church and state was used to stifle opposition and heresy. Anyone who opposed Calvin was dealt with severely, either deposed from their position or banished. We do have stories of these who opposed Calvin, perhaps opposed his doctrine of predestination, opposed his strictness and discipline, and so they would either, if they were a minister, they'd be deposed. If they were a civilian, they would be banished. And this raised opposition from what we call the Libertine Party, this group in Geneva that had banded together to expel Calvin before. They were still there, and they still were opposed to Calvin. And so they were seeking ways to limit his Puritanistic reforms. All right, again, I'll just pause to see, do we have any questions? Okay. Well, in the middle of this enters Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus was a Spanish reformer who taught anti-Trinitarian views, and he also was opposed to infant baptism. That's one reason why we include him as a radical reformer. Again, he's a rationalistic reformer with whom we would not agree much, but he wrote a treatise on the errors of the Trinity. He was condemned by the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, when he was brought to trial in France, one of the citizens, I think it was Leon, wrote to his cousin living in Geneva, asking for information about Servetus. His cousin got some answers from John Calvin, forwarded this information to the place where Servetus was in prison, and that information was used to convict Servetus and to sentence him to death. But Servetus escaped. He escaped execution. Well, if you were Servetus, where would you go? Any place but Geneva. He actually set out for Italy, but for some reason he ended up in Geneva, possibly with the deranged idea that he might convince Calvin to adopt his anti-Trinitarian views. Now, anyone who knows Calvin would know that Calvin is not easily persuaded.
Except for if you push the guy's going to condemn you.
Oh, okay. Yes, unless he points his finger and says God's going to condemn you, then Calvin can be persuaded. But no, he's not going to be persuaded to accept an anti-Trinitarian view. Well, he actually came to Calvin's church, and Calvin recognized him. There was nothing that Calvin could do but have him arrested, because he could not be seen as more lenient than the Roman Catholics who had condemned him. So he had Servetus arrested. Well, the Libertines hoped to use this as a public relations attack on Calvin for his narrow-mindedness, for his extreme discipline. And so they attempted to use Servetus as a test case against Calvin's reforms. But Servetus's views were too heretical for the council to overlook. So they actually sent letters out to other reformers in Switzerland, and universally they all wrote back to say that Servetus's views were heretical and must be punished. So the council condemned Servetus and burned him at the stake, October 27, 1553. Now, Calvin actually had requested from the council that they behead Servetus instead of burning him at the stake, in the sense that beheading would be more merciful than burning at the stake. But the council instead went forward with the burning. Well, of course, this is reprehensible to us, for those of us who believe in the free church, religious liberty, the separation of church and state. But it is, as we discussed earlier, for this period of time, these views against the Trinity were so radical and so heretical that they could not be overlooked and they could not be allowed to spread. And so the council went forward with what was a typical response of that day, was to execute Servetus as an example to others. Well, as a result of this, the Libertine Party then, who had sided with Servetus against Calvin, they were seen as the public relations coup that they had attempted turned against them. They were seen as having sided with a heretic, and so their resistance collapsed. And in 1555, then, Calvin was in control of Geneva. So he established this model covenant community in Geneva. 1559, he founded the Geneva Academy. Students came from all over Europe to study at the academy, and then they returned with Calvin's teachings, all right, which is certainly going to be advantageous in the spread of his writings and thought. Well, 1559, then he published his final edition of the Institutes. All right, he influenced the Reformation throughout Europe. Certainly, one of his key disciples is John Knox. John Knox, in leading the Reformation in Scotland, had been arrested, had been sentenced to slave labor on a galley. He had been freed by Edward VI, who was leading the Protestant Reformation in England. He actually contributed to the writing of the Articles of Faith. But then Mary of Tudor becomes queen, and she returns England to the Catholic faith and begins to persecute the Protestants, chief of which was John Knox, who fled England and ended up in Geneva and said that Geneva is the most perfect school of Christ. Then, after Mary's death, he returned to Scotland, and there he established the Presbyterian Church. We'll talk about John Knox later, but you can see how Calvin had tremendous influence over Knox and Presbyterian theology, which today is basically Calvinistic in its teaching and its practice. All right, Calvinism became really the most widespread form of the Reformation. In Switzerland, half the population; in France, the Huguenots; in England, the exiles brought Calvinism back to England. John Knox in Scotland, West Germany, the Netherlands, and then in New England, when the Puritans came to found the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were Calvinistic in their theology. And so we find Calvinism having major inroads and influence in America as well as in Europe. Now, I want to repeat what I hope I said last week, that Zwingli is a part of Reformed theology. Reformed theology is we think of it as Calvinism, named for John Calvin. All right, but Zwingli had many of the same emphases in his teaching: predestination, covenant theology, infant baptism, church discipline. These all were marks of Zwingli's Reformation, and so we need to. That's why so much of Switzerland is Reformed in its theology, because it had two proponents, Zwingli and Calvin. May 27th, 1564, Calvin died, and then leadership fell on Theodore Beza, who was at the time was the rector of he was rector of the university. He was a theologian and teacher of the Bible. He was Calvin's biographer, and he interpreted and systematized Calvinism versus the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, some of what we know as Calvinism, especially as it is formulated in Tulip, really comes from Beza rather than Calvin. But not that far from Calvin, but nonetheless, Beza is interpreted much of Calvin in the same way that Melanchthon interpreted Luther. Now, I usually take this opportunity to go on a rant against Wikipedia. And I want to say that Theodore Beza is not John Calvin's son-in-law. I once read that in a biography turned in by one of my students. And when I read that, I thought, how can that be? How can Theodore Beza be John Calvin's son-in-law and I not know about it? And so I did what all researchers do. I did a Google search. And sure enough, I found under Theodore Beza, Calvin son-in-law, took me to Wikipedia. And actually several other sources that quoted Wikipedia. But I did some primary research, and of course we know that Calvin did not have any offspring of his own, but he did have a stepdaughter by Idelette de Bure. Well, Calvin's stepdaughter, unfortunately, was accused of adultery. And so we can be well assured that she didn't marry Theodore Beza. And in fact, Theodore Beza had two wives. One was Claudine de Nos, and the other one was Catherine del Piano, neither of whom was John Calvin's daughter. Therefore, Theodore Beza was not John Calvin's son-in-law. The moral of this story is, do not use Wikipedia for research and a paper that you turn into me. Okay? Now, do I use Wikipedia? Of course. If you Google something, what's the first entry? The first entry is always from Wikipedia. They must be like this. And there's some good things about Wikipedia. Actually, I like the way they organize the information, and they have a great bibliography at the end. So that's really the best thing you can do from Wikipedia is get bibliography. But nonetheless, just be aware that Wikipedia is not a good source for information. Well, there's no charge for that rant. Let's talk about Calvin's theology. The key doctrine for Calvin is the doctrine of God. Right? It's not the doctrine of predestination, which is kind of what we think of when we think of Calvin. But predestination and everything else in Calvin's theology flows out of his doctrine of God, his belief that God is sovereign. There's no such thing as accident or chance. God is in control and causes all things. God is not required to explain anything. It's like the Scottish Presbyterian who fell down the stairs. He got up, brushed himself off, and said, "Oh, I'm glad that's over with," as if it was predestined for him to fall down the stairs, and he was glad that he got that behind him. But that's kind of an extreme predestination view, but nonetheless, that is consistent with Calvin's theology. His theology of the church taught that the marks of the true church were sound doctrine, right administration of the sacraments, and right administration of discipline. So those are the marks of the true church. Church government was representative or Presbyterian. That is, it comes out of the membership. We have representatives that then pass along the government to those organizations below. We've already talked about the fourfold ministry of pastor, teacher, elder, and deacon. We have the emphasis on the Old Testament. So here again, we see the same thought as Ulrich Zwingli. The church is analogous to Old Testament Israel. Therefore, God's pattern of dealing with Israel is the way God directs the church. And this was the model for theocracy in Geneva. We have two sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper. Like Luther, Calvin affirmed that infants have faith. Like Zwingli, he held that under the New Covenant, infant baptism is the same as circumcision, and obviously rejected the Anabaptist insistence on believers' baptism. With the Lord's Supper, he actually took a view that mediated between Luther and Zwingli. With Zwingli, he emphasized the Lord's Supper as a thanksgiving, a remembrance, a confession of faith in the atoning work of Christ. He rejected Luther's corporal presence, that is, the real presence of Christ in and around the elements, but he did teach the spiritual presence of Christ with the elements, where the participant receives Christ truly and effectually in the Lord's Supper. So, slight modification between Zwingli and Luther in his understanding of the Lord's Supper. All right, in predestination, he was influenced by Augustine. Augustine, by the way, is certainly the most influential of the early church fathers on the reformers. Luther coming out of an Augustinian monastery. When you study Calvin's writings, he quotes Augustine more than any other church father. Although I will say that both Luther and Calvin were utilized. Let's say they utilized teachings from the early church fathers frequently, but Augustine certainly number one. Now, Calvin taught double predestination, teaching that every person has been elected by God to either salvation or damnation. He taught that God elects some for salvation, God predestines others for damnation. Book 3, chapter 21, a very clear statement about double predestination. And this is not based on God's foreknowledge. It is not that God foreknows the individual's response to the gospel, but it is instead based on His sovereign will of election from the foundation of the world, even before the person was born. And so election is not based on any condition other than the will or sovereignty of God. Now, the best known formulation of Calvin's theology is obviously oversimplified. And it comes not so much from the Institutes of Christian Religion as it comes out of the Synod of Dort, which took place in 1619. And even so, the Synod of Dort is an action taken against the followers of Jacob Arminius, who presented their theology in 5 points. And so the Calvinists at Dort responded with 5 points. So you see that the 5 points really don't come from Calvin. He died in 1564. These 5 points don't really show up until 1619, and certainly not in TULIP because it was originally written in Dutch. But nonetheless, it is certainly helpful for those of us who are English students to grasp these 5 points of Calvinism: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Okay? The idea that every human being is born totally depraved and incapable of any good, incapable of any decision for God. Total depravity means that a human being is incapable of responding to God or incapable of doing any good. Therefore, our election by God is unconditional. It is not conditioned by any response or action on our part. We skip down to grace that is given to those who are elect is irresistible. When God elects, His choice is irresistible, and because of that, Christ's atonement is limited, and by that is usually meant the idea that Christ's blood was shed only for the elect. For Christ to die for the whole world would mean that His blood would be wasted on those who were non-elect. So that is the idea behind limited atonement. And then perseverance of the saints is the belief that those who are elect will persevere to the end. They cannot lose their salvation because their salvation is not dependent upon their actions, but is dependent upon the election of God, which is irreversible. All right, so that's basically those 5 points. Now, in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about Jacob Arminius and the Synod of Dort and at that point, we will we'll look more carefully at these 5 points. I do want to just stop and say this now, because I will say it again, and that is that the biggest complaint against Reformed theology is that it is antithetical to evangelism and missions. That is, there are those who criticize this theology, saying that if grace is irresistible, and if election is unconditional, then those who are elect, that number is predetermined by God, and therefore there is no need for us to witness, to evangelize, to send missionaries to the world, because all of this has been predetermined by God. All right? Now, that is not a fair representation of Reformed theology. We know this from history because of the number of those who profess Reformed theology and yet are some of our leaders in evangelism and missions, such as Andrew Fuller, William Carey, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, C.H. Spurgeon, and many others that I could name. Predestination does not nullify the incentive for evangelism and missions. As a Calvinist would say, we do not know who are elect and who are non-elect, so we must spread the word. Our evangelistic efforts are God's purpose of bringing the elect to salvation. God's ordaining the end includes ordaining the means. Knowledge that missions are God's means is a strong motive for the endeavor and gives us confidence that it will prove successful. Okay? So I say this in a way of defending Calvinism against these unfair accusations. While at the same time, as you will learn, I'm not a Calvinist, but I'm not anti-Calvinist either. All right, I'm one of those who wants to see Calvinists and non-Calvinists work together in the Southern Baptist Convention. And because I am a church historian, I have seen the history of Calvinists and non-Calvinists in the church, and seen both of them working for the kingdom of God. And because I've also seen the extremes of Calvinism, those Calvinists who have gone to such an extreme that one of them said, I will not give an invitation, nor will I witness individually, because I would not want to offer salvation to someone who is not elect. Okay, that is an extreme. Many times, the extreme of Arminianism then becomes universalism and liberal theology. So we want to avoid the extremes in any case. So as we proceed to talk about these issues, and we will continue throughout this entire semester to be talking about the issues of Reformed theology, its problems and its good, and those who oppose it. I just kind of want to lay out at the very beginning my understanding of Reformed theology. And even though I disagree strongly with all of its conclusions, nonetheless, I'm not one of those who is so opposed to it that I cannot see the good that has come out of Reformed theologians and pastors and preachers. Yes, Joey.
I was just curious, what is your thoughts on the early church meeting before Constantine? Because there's not a lot of material out on predestination and all this pre-Augustine stuff.
Right.
Why do you think that is? Why did the early church not have all that?
All right. Joey is asking what was what's the stand of the early church fathers on predestination. Well, I think let me just say, why did Augustine address the issue? And he addressed the issue because of Pelagius. Pelagius, who came out of a totally different background. He was a British monk. He was one who lived in his mind an exemplary life that earned him salvation. Taught that a human being could earn salvation through good works. Augustine, coming out of a lifestyle of immorality to the extent that he just felt like he could not even let go of the immorality in his life. Even when he became convinced that Christ was right and that he should become a Christian, he said, Lord, give me celibacy, but not yet. Okay, so Augustine came out of this background where he felt that only God's irresistible grace could save him. And so that's why we have this tension developing between Augustine and Pelagius. But even in response to Augustine, the church took a modified Augustinian view, where they talked about that yes, God initiated salvation, but a human being responded to God's offer of salvation. That's kind of where the church went. But before then, no, we don't really see this issue addressed before then that I know of. That might be a good topic for someone's paper next semester.
I'm just curious. I've always wanted to know that.
Yeah. All right. Was there another question, Thomas?
What about philosophy influence on Augustine?
All right. Thomas wants to know, what about philosophical influence on Augustine?
Did that play a part in his doctrine as well?
Well, certainly Augustine had been a Neoplatonist, and he'd followed Manichaeism earlier than that. And some think that Augustine's Manichaeism had influenced his idea of election, because the Manichaeans taught that there were some who were the elite, and these were the ones who held the key to salvation. And those who were hearers then would come to the elite to receive from them the teachings. And so this idea of elitism, some feel, led to Augustine's teaching about election. I think that's probably perhaps unfair. I think that probably is an observation by those who probably come with a presupposition in opposition to Augustine's election. Okay? People are waving at their watches as if it's time to go, and it certainly is getting close. So I do want to say thank you for listening to our lecture today. And again, we will have plenty of opportunities to talk about Reformed theology throughout the rest of the semester. So thank you very much.